Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Two Economists and a Lender, where we take a deep dive into the most important issues facing agriculture. I'm your host, Carly Jacobson. This month, we have a big, hairy topic, carbon markets. And we've taken a slightly different approach to this month's webinar format. So David Widmar and Brent Gloy from Agricultural Economic Insights will be tackling the business side of evaluating carbon markets from the farm level. And here to help us understand the science and the why behind the carbon markets is our new Vice President of Corporate Sustainability, Myriah Johnson. Brent, let me kick this over to you to get us started.
Thanks. Welcome, everybody. Hope everyone has had a productive first half of their morning. It's a little bit hard for me to believe that we're at the end of August and harvest is going to be starting really soon. So today's topic is one that we're all quite excited about. And I suppose serious questions about carbon markets or carbon programs, I started fielding them from usually friends first, and then people emailing me wanting information or wanting to know what I thought about various programs. Started really this spring, and so it's a topic that we are starting to hear a lot about, and I think we will continue to hear a lot about in the coming years. And so what we wanted to do was just provide a little bit of background today about what's going on in the space, what's driving it, and try and give you some ideas for how to think about carbon markets and how to approach it. So again, we're kind of in the fishing pole business, not going to tell you what to do, but try and give you some ideas about how to approach that stream and pull before you, so you can pull out some fish. So let's go ahead and get started, and we're going to start with a poll. And what I'd like you to do is just take a minute to quickly respond, say which of these descriptions fits you best. I'm currently enrolled in a carbon program. I'm evaluating it carefully. I'm watching it from a distance, or, I'm not really interested at all. Here we go. So by far, the most common response is that I'm taking a look at it from kind of a distance. I'm not, maybe down into the nitty gritty of evaluating it. And we have a few people that are actually enrolled. David, those results consistent with what you thought?
Well, of course, there's a selection bias, right? If you're completely uninterested, you probably didn't join us today. And we've seen some research or polls or ideas that said that maybe a lot of producers aren't interested. So I was glad to see folks joining on that had some interest. I think we're going to be able to really shed some light and some insights to really help those producers sort of move through the unknown or the uncertainty and maybe position themselves for some opportunities. So like we said, to kick this off at the beginning, as Carly mentioned, this has kind of been a big project for us to work on, especially to be consistent with our 30-minute format. And we're going to answer all your questions in the overtime after the 30-minute mark. But we flipped the script literally this month, and we're going to have our lender expert join us right at the beginning. So Myriah, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to spend just a little bit of time with you learning a bit about the science, and then Brent and I will wrap up with some strategies that producers can use to help, of course, position themselves. So again, Myriah, thanks for joining us. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your role with the association.
Thanks, David. It's good to be here today with you and Brent. I just appreciate the opportunity. So a little bit about myself. I grew up in north central Oklahoma on a cow-calf, stocker, and small grains operation, which is still actively run today by my family. I went to Oklahoma State and got a degree in agricultural economics, and then I went down to Texas A&M and got a master's in ag econ, and then a PhD in animal science. From there, I worked for the Noble Research Institute, which is a research and consulting organization in South Central Oklahoma. And I would say sustainability is one of those things that just kind of found me. I didn't go seeking it necessarily, but even when I was in grad school, I got part of my work was to look at algae, the production of that for biofuels, and look at the economic sustainability. And so that's probably where some of this really started in my career. And then while I was at Noble, I had the opportunity to get involved with the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. And that led to us putting together a full supply chain pilot project, testing out those metrics and indicators of the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. And then after being at Noble for 4 years, I went to the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and worked on the checkoff side of the organization, where I led that sustainability research program. And then I did a short stint with a carbon startup. So that gave me a little bit of time behind the lines, you will, learning about the carbon markets and what these startups are thinking and just all about that space. And like you mentioned, this is a new role for the associations, and I've been on board for about 2 months now in this role. And so really, this area has 3 different areas of focus, and those are around education, enablement, and engagement. And so what do we mean by that? And so education would be taking the opportunity to help producers, to help customers and teammates on sustainability issues, and helping shed light on what are some opportunities and what are the challenges in this space. I know it can be really hard to know which information to listen to and to know who to trust. And so being that trusted financial advisor as a lender, we also want to be that trusted advisor in this space as well. And so equipping customers with insights and awareness regarding this very fast evolving space on sustainable agriculture, and really helping our customers to remain competitive. And so in enablement, we want to enable our customers to participate in climate smart practices through new products and programs. And we recognize that there's a very wide spectrum of opinions in this, and it may be a good fit for some operations and not as great of a fit for others. And so one thing that we've been pretty adamant about is that we're going to continue to finance and insure agriculture as it comes, and we won't be dictating how you run your operation. That's very personal, and that's part of your individual choices as a producer. And then finally, under that engagement component, that would be that external facing piece of this role. And so that's engaging with other organizations to collaborate on sustainability partnerships and new opportunities that we think can bring value to our customers and to the associations.
Well, great. And you have a unique background and a lot of experience in this space. So I think it's going to be really valuable. It's been really valuable, and it's going to be really valuable for our audience to think about today. So I want to sort of go back to the beginning and have you help us think a little bit about carbon and how all this fits together, a little bit about the science.
Sure. And that science is tricky. And like I said, I had degrees in ag-econ and animal science. So it wasn't something that I felt super comfortable with even when I started. I think really the conversation around carbon sequestration and carbon markets, if we think about the why does anybody care about this, right? And so there's been a lot of discussion around global warming and the burning of fossil fuels. And so if we think about that, when we pull and create those fossil fuels, we're pulling up carbon from deep in the soil profile, and we're bringing that up into the atmosphere. So we're releasing that carbon. Meanwhile, we also have just kind of that natural carbon cycle that's occurring. And so that occurs when we have plants and live roots in the ground. Those plants, whether it's a crop or it's the grass or trees, go through that photosynthesis process. And so as part of that process, they pull in carbon and they use it in that plant growth. But as part of that, they can also take that carbon, pull it down into the root system. It can move down into the carbon or into the soil profile to where that carbon can be stored or sequestered. And so when we're thinking about this global warming and folks' concern around there, really climate change, it's really about getting that carbon out of the atmosphere back down into the soil. That's really where this all starts.
And so to build off that, how does ag fit into this?
Yeah, and so when we think about how does ag fit into this, well, when we think about all the other industries that there are out there, agriculture is the one that deals directly with the soil all of the time and has the capacity to pull that and influence that movement of carbon from the atmosphere down into the soil. So now that's not to say that we can control it completely, because we know that just the inherent soil type and weather can play a really huge role in this, and in some ways can almost dwarf our influence as a land manager. And so that's not to say that we're not going to try, right? We're still going to put those good management practices in place, but that's just knowing that there's only so much that we can do in some ways. And so you see on the slide that there's some examples of management impacts that can influence carbon storage, and this is in no way comprehensive. There are many different management practices that can influence this, but probably some of those practices that may be top of mind or may be familiar for folks would be the use of cover crops, reduced tillage or no-till, and also grazing management. I think we talk a lot about carbon storage in reference to cropland, but we can also do that with our grasslands or pasture lands as well, and really influence that through our grazing management with livestock. And then one other piece I'd throw out there, David, is just, the science. So science is continually evolving, but that doesn't mean we have all the answers either. And so, there are questions around how fast can we store carbon? Are there limits to storing carbon? We see some places that can sequester 1 ton to 4 tons of carbon per year per acre. Now, can we keep up that rate? Can we always store 3 or 4 tons each year? Some science says maybe so, some science says not so much. And so how quickly will that rate of sequestration decline? Will we reach a point of equilibrium? Will that be in the next 20 years or not for 100 or more? And so really there's some gaps in the science that are being worked on, but I think a lot of this uncertainty around carbon storage really leads to some of this uncertainty that we see in the carbon marketplace, and why there is struggle for it to get up and going in some respects.
I really appreciate that you mentioning sort of all the differences, because you think of this territory of the association, right? From Iowa all the way into Nebraska and Wyoming, and then you have from southeast Kansas all the way to South Dakota. There's a big geography, a big difference in how long the growing season is, but also how much moisture producers see throughout that year. So that could ultimately impact some of these capacity issues, right?
Absolutely. And so, we think about some of those soils that have more moisture or more rich already in their soil organic carbon content, that they can store more. But I would say what we lack in rainfall in that soil type, as we move west in some ways, we certainly make up with in vastness.
So can you help us think a little bit about how a carbon credit gets from the farm or the field all the way maybe to the end user, maybe an airline, for example?
Sure. And so, for me, even it's probably easiest to think about this. Carbon's just another commodity in some ways. So we're already used to, as farmers and ranchers, supplying that commodity. We're producing something off the land, and then it goes into the marketplace. There are middlemen, and that it passes through before it ever gets to that end buyer. And so with carbon, it's similar. So we, as that producer, we sequester that 1 ton of carbon into our soil. And so, okay, we have stored that 1 ton of carbon. Now what? Now, before it can really go into the market and be sold to anyone, there has to be some sort of oversight into that, because it's pretty hard to look out and say, yeah, there's 1 ton of carbon in that soil. So we have these entities that are in the business of doing monitoring and reporting. So they're doing things like coming out and taking soil tests and looking at that carbon content in the soil at kind of that before and after period. And so then they can say, yeah, you've stored 1 ton of carbon. And so then they have to turn around and get that verified. And sometimes that happens all with the same middleman. But that verifier will say, you know what, your carbon sampling protocol looks good. You took enough samples from enough places in the right spots that, we agree, 1 ton of carbon there. And so then once we have that certificate for 1 ton of carbon, it has to be put into a carbon registry, which is really a way to where it's preventing the double sale of that same ton of carbon into the marketplace. So then when that ton of carbon is sold, then it's marked off the registry and it can't be sold again. And so then ultimately you get to the buyer, because that buyer wants to make sure that they have a really good quality product and that they're paying money for actual carbon that's been put into the soil. And so that would be what would be referred to as an offset. So it's kind of that certificate of 1 ton of carbon that's moving all the way from that supplier at the farm level all the way to that buyer. And so you mentioned the airline industry, David, and they might be a buyer because, when we talk about who buys these carbon credits, it's really those polluters that can't get their emissions reduced all the way to zero. So as we think about Delta, for instance, they're flying their planes around the country, And so even if they're using renewable fuels, they probably still can't get their entire greenhouse gas footprint to zero, but yet they're making those commitments. And so they're saying, okay, I've emitted 1 ton of carbon, so now I need to go offset that and buy 1 ton of carbon that's been sequestered.
Got a couple questions left for you. The first one is around some of the terms I've been hearing. So maybe you can kind of help us work through that. Offset, inset, additionality. We have a resource that we're going to share that kind of works through some of these terms, but can you just talk real briefly about some of these different terms that producers might want to be listening for as they think about and approach this opportunity?
Sure. And I would say the vocabulary here, it takes a while to get up to speed on. I mean, I feel like it's taken me a while too. And so, like I mentioned, the offset is, I like to think of it as that certificate, that 1 ton of carbon that's been sequestered. I have that little certificate that says I've done that, and that can be sold into the marketplace. The other term that folks might hear is an inset. And so that ton of carbon that's been sequestered can essentially be sold as an offset or an inset, but not as both. And so that inset is essentially taking that 1 ton of carbon sequestration and pairing that with the commodity that's coming off of your land. And that goes with that product through the supply chain. So for instance, we think about consumers maybe wanting to buy a low carbon steak, right? So how do we know that we have a low carbon steak? How do we know that this steak on our plate was produced, in a way that sequestered carbon and it has a smaller greenhouse gas footprint relative to just your average commodity steak? Well, that's because there's been an inset put with it. And so it's kind of that digital paper trail, that those have been paired together along the supply chain. As you mentioned, kind of some other vernacular out there, additionality. So that additionality is saying we need to go above and beyond, and that's what a lot of these companies are looking for. They don't want to pay for status quo. They know that if they're paying for carbon that has been stored that would not have been stored otherwise. Another piece would be permanence. And so again, companies want to make sure they're buying carbon that's being stored in the soil for the long term, and that is not just being released next year. So they're kind of continually repaying for that same thing. And then other terms, verifiability, leakage, and there's so many. And I know that that resource that you have is going to really go through a lot of those and is a good piece to have.
Yeah, so watch your follow-up emails for that. We have some other resources too. But last question I have for you at this point, again, we're going to get to all the questions in the Q&A here at the end of the 30-minute mark, but we talked about carbon and opportunities there, but let's zoom out a little bit for something that you described as ecosystem services. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and so like you said, this is a bit of a zooming out perspective. So today the thing is carbon. That's what we're really talking about. But I would say in those kind of fringe conversations and those that are on the boundaries and pushing the edge, it's really becoming about ecosystem services. So ecosystem services are the things that the land provides to us, those benefits that we receive as a human society. And so in a lot of ways, these are things that are already happening, but that we as consumers, as humans on this earth, are not necessarily paying for, because we're only paying for that commodity that's coming off the land. But perhaps there's a chance to pay land managers for also managing for these ecosystem services. So carbon is just one of those. Other ecosystem services would include water quality and water quantity. And as we see, water is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. So I definitely think this one's going to creep in soon and get picked up in discussions more. But then the last one I have here on the screen is biodiversity. And so that would be biodiversity of the plants, of the grasses that are on the land, but also biodiversity of the animals, birds, butterflies, insects, all of those. Do we have that healthy functioning ecosystem? So I'd say keep an eye on that, because I think that's something you're going to hear more and more about.
Well, thank you so much for your time thus far, and we'll get you back on here for the Q&A. At this point, I'm going to kick it over to Brent. We're going to think a little bit more about sort of that decision-making process that takes place on the farm. So Brent, will you kick us off?
Yeah, thanks, David. Well, I think one of the things we need to realize when we think about a carbon program is it's kind of like any other product you would sell. So for example, if you're offered $7 a bushel for corn, would you take it? Well, it's not necessarily, that's probably not enough information for you to completely make that decision. You have to think about, well, how many bushels do I sell, and when is that to be delivered, and where is it to be delivered, and what's the quality standards that are required, and what are the discounts or payment terms, and what's the counterparty risk that might be associated with it. So just a whole host of questions. So I think oftentimes when people start with carbon, they'll say, well, I got offered X dollars an acre. And you have to step back and say, for what, when, and how. And it's really important to kind of evaluate all the details of those offers so that we understand what we're selling. And I think that's just really important. So dig into those details. And if you don't understand them, I think that's an important key that, it's time for some further investigation.
And I think the other piece to that is, we get really comfortable selling corn. We kind of intuitively know these things. And so the, first bushels of corn sold had to deal with some of these issues of defining these terms or defining these attributes. And so in time, as this becomes more mature and more awareness and more knowledge, these will be more of a second nature, right? We'll be able to move more fluently through these. And so some of this is right. That learning curve and the establishment of the process. The other kind of observation we've made is see a lot of kind of approaching opportunities on this one-off basis. And I describe this as avoiding the whack-a-mole approach, this idea of like, sometimes we only are looking at the opportunity that's right in front of us, and we're not stepping back and taking a bigger picture. So, we had this sort of hypothetical environment here where maybe one option is a 10-year commitment that doesn't include any current no-till production, and the data seems really intensive. If we only look at that, we might sort of reach a conclusion about the whole universe. And so what we want to do is step back and say, well, what are all the options that are presented to me, and how does that sort of fit into the situation? So really wanted to sort of get off the avoid scenarios where we're only considering that one opportunity in front of us, and that's sort of driving our thought process for the rest of that opportunity, the entire space, and how can we approach this a little more proactively. We also outlined 6 questions here that are strategic in nature. I think they're really helpful for you to think about and write down for yourself. Like we've always, talked about before, writing it down can be really powerful. Write down your answers, maybe even date it in a bit of a journal scenario, and then have your family members, your employees, or those trusted advisors you work with capture their thoughts, and then revisit this. And we're going to talk about this as well, but see how your ideas change over time. And this is an opportunity for you to really see where you can dive in a little bit and maybe areas or weaknesses that you can improve on. So the first point here, the first question for you to consider, what are your current thoughts and expectations? And so maybe you're on one end of the spectrum where you're really excited about this and you think it could change the world and there's no downside to it. Well, capture that, but then also challenge yourself, say, well, what would cause you to change your mind? And then maybe you're on the other side of that spectrum where you have a lot of doubt, a lot of skepticism. Capture that, but also challenge yourself and say, well, what would cause me to change my mind on this? What information maybe could be known in the future that I would want to revisit those assumptions and those base cases. Question 2 is, what are maybe your farm-specific barriers to adoption? This is kind of a self-reflection. It can kind of be a little bit difficult to do this, but do you have limited knowledge about this? Are these terms kind of new? Do you need to brush up on some of the vocabulary? Are there no acceptable options or no acceptable contracts to you today? Is there a significant management burden? And I always think back to the story of the iPod being invented, and Apple had stepped back and said, this is the parameters that we need to build this iPod. Well, when they did this, that technology didn't exist. But a few years later, there's a revolution in some of the technology, and then they could pursue that. So if you can identify those barriers up front, it allows you to not just sort of push this off and forget about it. It allows you to kind of keep your decision-making process idle, and it allows you to keep it sort of not idle, but sort of activated, but not shut down. So you're going to be able to move whenever the opportunity comes forward. And the third point here is, can you make incremental decisions? This is something we've been thinking about a lot, given all the uncertainty in ag and ag markets. We don't necessarily sell all of our corn on all of our acres or all of our bushels on one day. We layer those in. And so another way we can think about this is, can you make incremental decisions on your farm? Can you enroll a few fields or part of the farm or a few commodities? Can you make incremental decisions that allow you to, again, position yourself to make some progress on that learning curve, but to also see how you might make adjustments and pivot as you move forward? Brent, we want to wrap us up for the next 3 considerations.
You bet. And so I think just to reiterate one of your points about, what would change your mind, I think is really important. So for instance, I mean, many years ago, I made a bet on grain basis that went poorly for me. And ever since then, I had just said, well, that was stupid. I'll never do that again. But honestly, it wasn't, when you think about the decision, it wasn't necessarily that bad a decision. It didn't turn out right. But it's really important to kind of sit back and think about, well, what's different about the situation today than it was then? And is it still the right decision just to ignore it? And so I think the other things we need to think about are, what are the risks of early adoption? Could you get locked into the wrong program? Vice versa, what's the risk of adopting late? And typically in agriculture, on the technology side, there's rewards to not necessarily being the first, but to be somewhere in that early stage of the adoption. So there's something to think about. And then, are there other things? Can programs overlap, or do they fit with your future plans? And so can we accomplish maybe a couple things at once? And so I think at the end of the day, as I said before, just revisit those decisions frequently. And this doesn't have to be a static one-time decision. And so with that, I think the key thing with all these carbon programs is be realistic. And oftentimes I like to say, so if they talk to a lot of people are really interested in investing in farmland, and the people are really, really bullish, have really, really high expectations for what the carbon payments might be. But I think it's useful just to think about what are the range of expectations that you might have for carbon streams, and then what's most likely, and try and get narrowed in on that. But ultimately, we'll probably get bid into the price of farmland. And so, thinking about, what those payment streams might be, I think is a worthwhile endeavor. And I think if you talk to a variety of people, you will get wildly differing numbers. And that's not to say, somebody's going to be right, somebody's going to be wrong. But the reality is right now, there's a lot of uncertainty, and reasonable people can have guesses on both ends of that spectrum. I think the other thing to remember is that there is a lot of market uncertainty. So oftentimes in agriculture, for instance, ethanol came along and got big enough that it influenced the price of corn, and that changed the economics of it. In this market, carbon is really, really, really big market. And for those of you who are interested in really taking a deep dive into understanding all the variety of things that could go on with carbon policy, I strongly encourage you to watch or listen to our podcast, Corn Saves America. It examines ethanol policy, but with a view toward what might we learn about how carbon policy might evolve. And I will tell you, I learned a lot myself in that podcast. It's not just Brent and David. We have some really good experts on that podcast, and they brought a lot of interesting perspectives to the table, and it changed my thinking on a few things, and we talk about that in the podcast. So we do have a lot of really good questions. And I know Myriah talked a little bit about the carbon supply chain and how there's various steps in that. And anytime you see a supply chain like that, the first question that usually comes to mind is, well, who's getting what in that supply chain? And so, I don't know if you know this, but maybe you have an idea of kind of what's the percentage of the credit that goes to the various people in the supply chain, and who might be some of the so anyway, we'll start with that.
Yeah. And I think this is one that's really all over the board, honestly, at this point in time, because a lot of those companies that are getting into this space, they're trying to figure that out. And so I've seen a lot of different models. So some will say, okay, you're getting $20 a ton per acre. We're going to take 25% of that. So that means we get $5 per ton. Other companies, of course, when they're doing that monitoring and that reporting, the verification piece, those companies have costs. And so they'll say, okay, we're going to take, 40%, but that's going to be the after cost. So that of the profit. So once we subtract out all the costs that it took us to get that carbon credit certified, then we'll split, that profit that's remaining with you. And so it kind of depends on that model. And so really, I'd say those are some of the contract details to really pay attention to.
Okay. So another question is, why are companies interested in buying credits? Why? So let's start with that. And I think it is important to point out that at this point, all the carbon programs out there that I'm aware of are private sector driven, so not government driven. Whereas think about the ethanol policy, that is a government mandated policy. It's different. So these are companies are buying them. Why are they buying those?
Yeah. And so, like you mentioned, Brent, a lot of this is the voluntary space right now. Nobody's necessarily requiring it. As a lot of these companies put together their carbon commitments, their greenhouse gas commitments, and that really goes back to an even broader conversation around that whole Paris Accord. These companies are making these commitments to be carbon neutral, greenhouse climate neutral, whatever their exact term is, by some year, 2040, 2050, 2035, you pick it. And so as a way to start trying to move towards that goal, those companies are realizing, okay, we can throw all the money and all the technology at it, but in whatever our industry is, we inherently can't be carbon neutral. So that means whatever chunk of this that we can't get to carbon neutral on, we need to go buy an offset to make us essentially carbon neutral from an accounting perspective.
So it's one of these things, and I don't know. I mean, I don't want to be irreverent here, but it's a little bit like indulgences. So I want to fly my private jet, but I don't want to. I want to be able to, say I'm not having an impact on the environment. So I'm going to pay somebody else to take that reduction in greenhouse gas emissions somewhere else. And so it's just a way to kind of transfer what's happening. But all that whole system then is really critically dependent, whether it works or not, dependent upon whether the person you're paying is really doing something that sequesters carbon. And that's the next question: is agriculture really creating ways to increase the amount of carbon, or simply maintaining and monetizing the carbon that they already store?
Yeah, I'd say there's been a lot of discussion around this one, a lot of consternation, because there's definitely folks and organizations that realize the value in just having that carbon stored, right? And, if I, as a producer or a marketer of carbon, really in some ways want to maximize my bottom line in this space, the incentive almost is to go out and just rip up my land, release a whole lot of carbon, then get into this program and try to store all that back in. But that's not necessarily really, I think, meeting the overall goal of moving carbon back into the soil, because we've released so much of it. But in some ways, that's almost how some of these markets are set up. And so there have been a lot of fights, a lot of discussion around, okay, well, how are we going to reward the people that have been doing this for years, or people who have made the choice not to rip up and release a lot of carbon? And so I think a lot of this plays into some of that uncertainty that we talked about, and why this is not standardized yet, and why it's just a really messy space, is because all of those things are getting hammered out and discussed, and people have gone round and round on them, honestly, for the past 5+ years.
And I think that, the principle, I guess, that's getting in the way is that idea of additionality. And it makes it complicated because, for instance, let's say I have a tree growing in my front yard, and they say, well, if you don't pay me for the carbon that's in that tree, I'm just going to go cut it down. Nobody's going to pay me because I'm not going to cut my tree down. They know they are. No rational person would pay me to not cut my tree down and maintain it. So this is part of the discussion, but I think one of the things we talk about in our podcast is different ways to look at this. And that additionality principle is sound in some ways, and in some ways it makes things really difficult. And another approach to looking at would be to say, conduct some kind of benchmarking. And so here's the average emissions in, let's say, grazing industry. And if you're better than average, you get credits. And if you're below average, say you might have to buy credits if they were regulated. So there's all kinds of different ways, but that it gets complicated. And I think that sows a lot of confusion. And that's why it's going to be hard to get these things really rolling for a while without a lot of kind of federal policy. But it creates, I think, skepticism, and people are annoyed because there's another comment in here I just see in the questions about, well, I've been managing my grazing land sustainably for a long time, and why should I not be able to benefit from that where other people who weren't can benefit from it? And that is the sticking point right there. And I get it. It's a tough one. And so we'll just have to see how it evolves. You would think that people figure out ways to do it. So set up programs so that you don't want to encourage people to do bad things so they can do good things. That doesn't make any sense. So anyway, what about lengths of contracts? Here some are over 20 years. Somebody asked, is that reasonable? And what do you know? And David or Myriah, you might know. David, I haven't. I've seen some of those long contracts, but I don't know if there's others out there.
I think this is another example of sort of one, finding what the options are that are available for your operation. So there might be an option out there that exists for you, but that might not be the only option. And I think the second piece here is determining if that makes sense for your operation. And some of you listening today would say, yeah, I like that stability. I like that type of a program. And some of you might say, no, that's not for me. But I think that's kind of one of the key management considerations is, do you prefer a longer term or a short term? What are the pros? What are the cons? And really think critically about that and be kind of on the lookout for opportunities that line up with some of those considerations or some of those concerns that you already have identified. So kind of create your own list of your own preference list, and then go find something that matches up with that.
What are some of the first steps a farmer should take to prepare for taking advantage of ecosystem services markets? And I think Myriah brought that up. I think it's a really interesting idea, and we do this already in a big way. So the Conservation Reserve Program is, in essence, an ecosystem services program, right? We take land out of production and put it into native or grasslands. And so the first step is to find the programs that are available. And I think there are a lot of those available through the Farm Services Agency and the NRCS already. And so that's one of the first things I think that one should directions one should head. Let's say you're a producer and you claim an inset type of deal. So, maybe you're selling a branded meat product and you want to sell it as, carbon managed, carbon friendly steak or something. How does that eliminate the ability to capture value for your management as an offset, or would it?
Sure. And so that kind of goes back to that piece where I talked about the registries, right? And so if that we have verified that this is a lower carbon beef product and it's being marketed and sold through the supply chain that way, then that, the registry is only going to allow it to go that way, as opposed to if I don't, and this is just, I sell my beef as commodity beef, then I would still have that offset available to sell into that offset marketplace.
Trying to eliminate the ability to sell things, the same offset 2 or 3 times, which, it is important. And if the system were to actually reduce carbon emissions, because if it's sold multiple times, then you're not getting actually enough offsets, and you're going to have emissions increasing.
Yeah, and I'd say too, Brent, one piece that gets a little bit tricky in there is several of these commodity groups, whether it's beef or it's corn or soybeans, or pick the commodity, right? Or even making kind of these claims around, we as an industry are going to achieve these goals and targets, and that we have, really sustainable type product. Well, if we keep selling the offsets, then we can't attribute that or associate that with the commodity product. So it makes it a little bit hard to claim like, oh, well, I have this low carbon commodity because I've sold the carbon that we stored. So that gets a little bit messy too within those industries.
How would you recommend talking with landlords on rented farms about these programs? David?
I'll take a first stab at this. I think the question is really great because it's something that we've thought a lot about, is that if there's a lot of economic value that the ag sector is going to see from this, it's going to get bid into, a large portion of that will get bid in to higher cash rents and to the farmland values ultimately. And so the question is really great. The farmer might have the expense of changing the practice, but the owner, of course, owns the land. And I think there's a lot of ways to think about this. In some ways, it could be additional revenue that, this farm currently isn't enrolled in a program. You want to put a bid in on it, and so you're going to be able to bid up that rent and maybe get a top bid by enrolling in that program. But on the other end of the spectrum, that might be a marketing position for you. So you're going to say, hey, I can match this other bid, but by the way, I want to enroll this in this program or this ecosystem service program, and that might be appealing to that landowner. But I think so I don't have a crystal ball answer for you. That's going to be something that you're going to have to figure out for your operation and for those you're renting land from. I think it's a very important conversation to have. It's going to be a conversation that could differentiate you from others in the market that might be interested in renting that land, but ultimately realizing that when there are strong profits in agriculture or strong returns, it ultimately sort of makes its way back to that acre of land.
Yeah, and related to that, should there be concerns about the future sale of land? Seems like a carbon contract could impact the sale, similar to easements today. And I think, yes, I think there's reason. Again, when you go back to that list of questions, you need to understand what the implications are of any contracts you might sign, because it could ultimately have some bearing on what's going on. So if it doesn't, then theoretically it wouldn't be much of an offset, because if you're paid to have a higher proportion of carbon in your soil and it's sold and the next person goes and releases it all, well, there should be some kind of one would think consequences for that. So if not, it would make one question the viability of the program. So not a lawyer, don't know, but something to think about, and I think something you would want to consider. What about burning pastures? Does that affect carbon storage? This has been going on for millions of years. Yeah, it's a good question. And one of the things I think that we need to think about is that it's not so much the carbon above ground that is interested. And so I had a friend that emailed me with a bet maybe a year or so ago, and he said, "Well, this guy's telling me that there's more carbon stored in the Corn Belt than in the Amazon." And I'm like, well, for maybe a few months, yes, but the reality is not really, because that corn is growing, is going to decompose, and some of it is in the soil, but that the soil can only hold so much. Which, by the way, the science of it, measuring that carbon is tough, and so yeah, I think there's just lots of questions going around that need to be explained. But ultimately, the stored carbon, I think, Myriah, unless I'm wrong, would be the stuff below the ground, not above the ground.
Yeah, there's certainly that piece of it. And yes, when we do some of that pasture burning, there is that carbon release. But in some ways, there's also this piece of trade-off. So if we get back to that greater ecosystem service, right? So when we burn those pastures, it helps us to manage those in a way like the question asker, put in. We've been doing that for millions of years, and it's actually a very good land management practice. And we need that on the land because that does help us to get some of that, invasive species out of there. It does help us to have different grass types, forbs, all of those things come up, which are great biodiversity in our plant species, but also food for the animals. And so it helps bring the biodiversity of those animals back into that ecosystem. And so when we think about it from that broader perspective, and as we move into kind of that ecosystem service discussion and not just the carbon discussion, hopefully some of those things will work themselves out a little bit, but I think that, that's certainly a practice that needs to stay on the table.
So if there's a baseline soil sample from say 5 years ago, and now we've implemented some of these practices, is it possible to capture what's been done since the day X in the past?
I think that one really depends on the program that you choose to go with. I mean, y'all might be seeing different things, but that's a little bit of what I've seen is, some of these programs have what they call a look back period. And so those look back periods, they usually are not going to go forever back, right? So that's kind of the downside. But they might go 2 years, 3 years. I don't know if I've heard any of that are 5 years. Most of them that I've seen have just been that 2 or 3 year look back period. That really kind of depends on, like, do you have that information in place and can you document it? But also, what sort of model are they using to estimate how much carbon you have stored over that period of time?
Yeah. And again, there's all kinds of different programs out there, and things are evolving rapidly. But here's another different take on it, and I think this is important to think as well. This is, I'm interested in some of these initiatives, but sometimes it's hard to see a payoff of it. Can we get over that and use some of these programs to help us do programs that make sense? And I think, so here's someone who's wanting to kind of adopt some of these practices. And I think, again, look at programs, even from, I think the government has some programs for cover crops and other things in certain areas. You just want to keep investigating and working toward it. Continue to kind of research and see what's available.
Yeah, with a lot of those, I'd say this is where some of those companies in this space are differentiating themselves a little. Again, back to what is their business model, right? So some of them are saying, we're not going to pay you until, 10 years in, we can verify that you've stored the carbon. Now you get the money and it goes through that whole process. And so you as the producer really are footing that bill up front. There are other programs that are starting to shift their models a little bit just because they do see this as a hurdle. And they'll say, okay, we're going to run a model and we're going to estimate how much carbon you're going to store. And so we might give you half of that value up front. And so that way you have some money to go deploy this, right? And start storing that carbon. And so then as they come back and they measure how much carbon you've actually stored over, say, the next 3-5 years, then they can kind of true that up and say, well, you've actually stored this much as compared to how much we estimated you would. And, here's how much we paid you. And so here's the difference that's left, that you've earned. And so again, checking out those different carbon companies that are out there. And so, you really do have to be careful in looking at each one of them.
So to wrap this up, I wanted to ask Myriah the billboard question. We didn't get to the billboard question earlier. So Myriah, to wrap up today's conversation, I want to ask you, what's one piece of advice that you could put on a billboard for thousands of producers to see here in August of 2022? It can be very applicable to today's topic, or it can be more broadly. So what would you put on that billboard?
We talked about this previously, David, and I actually have a different response today.
Great.
Going through all these questions, I would say the devil is in the details, right? So that's where we've talked about all these different companies or slightly different business models. Who has what about this? What about that? And everybody's doing a little bit differently. So the devil is in the details, and we really have to investigate, which avenue, which company is going to help us best achieve our goals as a producer.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Myriah. Thank you all for joining us. We had a lot of great questions. I think we got most of them covered, but, as Brent mentioned earlier, there's a lot of them were sort of similar that we already covered. So I think we got through most of them for you. Carly, I think that's it for today.
It is for today, but I can promise you with the number of questions and the quality of questions we have coming in, it won't be the last time you hear from us on this topic as well. So that'll do it for another episode of To Economist and Lender. Thank you, David, Brent, and Myriah for leading today's conversation. And to you in the audience, thank you for your questions and thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you online again next month.